On July 20th, 1969, the entire world watched with held breath, waiting in excitement for the first steps on a new terrain, a new location, the moon.
It's a little shadowy, but he said he expected that in the shadow of the lunar module. Armstrong is on the moon. Neil Armstrong, 38-year-old American, standing on the surface of the moon on this July 20th, 1969.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
On July 20th, 1969, a new age of human innovation was reached. And perhaps the greatest achievement of mankind, 3 American astronauts left Earth and traveled almost 240,000 miles and walked the first steps on the moon.
But what led to this momentous event in U.S. history? Why was the United States so motivated to dedicate money, manpower, and other resources to landing on the moon? Where did we even start?
The truth is, the moon landing would never have occurred if not for the intense rivalry of the United States and the Soviet Union.
Coming off the high of winning the Second World War, the United States was in a period of great economic prosperity. America had more than doubled her gross income. Americans were being paid better wages, and the middle class was greatly expanding. America, which already was a global superpower prior to the war, had now been established as the strongest country.
But not all was well in the United States. After World War II, tensions between the Communist Soviet Union and the Democratic United States soared as the pair battled a proxy war of global influence. The two countries also started building increasing numbers of nuclear weapons in what became known as the arms race. In the summer of 1956, the United States announced their intentions to launch the first artificial satellite into orbit around the Earth. And not to be outdone by their rivals, the Soviets announced the same goal only 2 days later, hence commencing the space race.
By launching the first satellite before the United States, the Soviets had established a firm lead in the space race. This was very concerning to many Americans who were worried about the military implications of the Soviets being able to launch objects into space, and it made the United States have to play catch-up for the rest of the space race.
So you have to imagine being a U.S. citizen at this time. You've got the growing superpower that's your rival in the USSR, and they beat your country into space. The citizens at this time were definitely feeling a lot of fear, a lot of nervousness about the state of their country, as opposed to the Soviet Union, which they were already afraid of, and communism, which they were afraid of. And that's exactly what Sputnik caused. It caused a state of fear, frenzy in the country because we lost the early part of the space race.
The US did launch its own satellite a few months later, but the blow of not being first was still apparent. The next few years were a back and forth rotation of the two powers, each creating new innovations and accomplishing new tasks before the other could. The US took the first pictures of Earth from outer space and created the first weather satellite, among other things. The USSR, on the other hand, was more focused on the moon and had the first impact into the moon with Luna 2. Despite the playing field evening out, a lack of governmental concern in the US for the space race, as well as the remaining disappointment in the US for losing the race to launch the first satellite, kept a strong concern for the USS's involvement in the space race in imminence.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win.
The election of 1960 was a heated and heavily debated one between Richard Nixon and John F. Kennedy. Democrat Kennedy won the presidency and instantly began reaching for the stars.
Kennedy revitalized the space operations and he took control. And all of a sudden, the U.S. started to get the results they wanted.
Kennedy won this election in part of his emphasis on the need to compete in the space race. He addressed the public's fear and gave them reason to believe again. He gave the United States an end goal to reach in the space race, landing and returning a man from the moon by using a program called Apollo. When Kennedy was assassinated in 1963, it was a devastating loss for the U.S., but production did not stop. Within a year, the U.S. had their first spacewalk, their first Mars flyby, and several space observatories. Kennedy had laid down the foundation for the U.S. to continue pushing forward, even after his untimely death.
On July 16, 1969, not knowing if they would ever come back, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins took the enormous step of being launched towards the moon.
So, how old are you when the Apollo 11 landed on the moon?
I would have been 69, right? 1969? 63 to 69. That makes 6.
Okay. And 600 million people worldwide watched through the television, on the radio, or different sources of media the American landing on the moon. And were you following it live?
Yeah, I completely remember it. They had it in the, geez, it must have been like a second grade classroom or something like that. Maybe. I have strong memories of being in a classroom, and they had it up on a black and white TV, and everybody came in and we watched it, and it was cool. It was great.
Understand just how important this achievement was. For thousands of years, humans have been looking up in the sky at the moon, not knowing what it was, and now we have landed someone on the moon. And the people who did it was the Americans, and that really showed us it showed global power, it showed global influence. It was just an amazing achievement for humanity, and it was America who did it.
And how were the feelings? Like, what was the class emotions? What were your own personal emotions when you saw this?
I mean, that's a long time ago.
Yeah,
Let's get that straight. I was just a little kid, so but I mean, obviously impressive, because here it is all these years later, and I remember it. Yeah, I definitely remember it. So it must have been strong.
Yeah.
The Apollo program was able to send 5 more astronauts to the moon to further explore the geography and the topography of the moon, as well as run other scientific experiments. However, the Russians tried to land on the moon a few times, but did not have the funding or the dedication to get there. The space race contributed greatly to many modern technologies that are essential parts of the world today. Competition between the US and Soviets encouraged both to develop new technologies which paved the way for modern infrastructure, such as GPS, instant communication, and weather monitoring, among other things. None of these would have happened without the space race.
In 1972, NASA launched the Pioneer 10 into space. This probe was the first man-made craft to reach Jupiter and send photos of it back to Earth. From there, it continued onwards, sending back data from deep space past the major planets of the solar system, until 30 years later, 12 billion kilometers away from Earth.
When we opened hatch in space, we were opening back on the Earth an era in the history of man.
The first multinational human crew on July 15, 1975, signaled a technical end to the space race between the USSR and the US, as the two countries were finally collaborating on their efforts to advance their knowledge about space. That being said, the Cold War between the two countries did not end with the space war, as tensions remained intact between the two superpowers and did not end for almost another decade after. Also, the competition for space flight capability in the world continued to rise, as new technology and missions were introduced constantly, leading all the way into the modern era and continuing on today. Space is a piece of history the U.S. will long remember as a huge victory for our country, but the impact it had on the world is far more profound than the actual outcome. Imagine a world where we did not land on the moon, or we did not launch satellites into space to discover more about the unknown that's out beyond our atmosphere. Imagine a world without the space race. Who knows where we would be right now without it?
It goes to show that with passionate leadership and the mobilization of an entire country, anything is possible, even the stars.